So, we're going to continue our series this morning in Romans. And I don't know about you, but I've often wondered about how some of the Old Testament believers would have felt and how they managed to have faith in God. I mean, it's okay for you and me, isn't it? Because we've read to the end of the book. We have the whole Bible at our disposal. But they were living the book. They were living the book. And the New Testament hadn't actually been written yet. I mean, we find it hard enough in life, and we know the ending. I've got a bit of a guilty pleasure. I love reading Agatha Christie novels, but I also flick to the end of the book. I start reading like the first 7 or 8 pages, and I think, and then let's go and have a little look at the end. And then I'll carry on reading it quite happily. And I know that's a stupid thing to do, but I've always done it. I quite like sneaking a preview. But the Old Testament believers didn't have that option. They didn't have the option of sneaking to the end and having a preview. They just had to trust in faith and act on what they were told at that time. So this week we're going to look at the Old Testament believers and what they have to teach us. And we are going to do a fair bit of Bible reading, but I don't think that's a bad thing. But I also want to tie that in very much with what Heather taught us last week. And there's going to be 2 strands to our thoughts today. One, were the Old Testament believers the same as us? Were they the same as us? How did they make themselves right with God? Did they earn their way into God's good books? And the second train of thought is, what can the Old Testament believers teach us going forward in life? So let's get going. Let's start by reading together from the book of Romans, which we're working our way through at the moment. And we're going to turn to chapter 4. Now, I'm going to be reading from the NLT version, but you can read from whatever version you have. And we're going to be reading verses 1 to 8. Abraham was, humanly speaking, the founder of our Jewish nation. What did he discover about being made right with God? If his good deeds had made him acceptable to God, he would have had something to boast about. But that was not God's way. For the scriptures tell us Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. When people work, their wages are not a gift, but something they've earned. But people are counted as righteous not because of their work, but because of their faith in God who forgives sinners. David also spoke of this when he described the happiness of those who are declared righteous without working for it. Oh, what joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sins are put out of sight. Yes, what joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of sin. Now, some of the books of the Bible can sometimes be a little bit hard to understand, can't they? But they are always full of truth that's really important to us today and very, very relevant. This passage, which comes from the letter the Apostle Paul is writing to the church that was based in Rome, that passage is basically endorsing the message that Heather gave us last week. The message that we've all sinned. We've all got things wrong. We've all made mistakes. And we've all come short of what God requires from us. And that nothing we can do on our own account will ever be good enough for God. I really loved the analogy that Heather gave us last week of people trying to compare them, how bad they are, against other people. And her example of someone standing at the bottom of a mine shaft and another on the top of a mountain, but they are both unable to touch the stars. Isn't that a really good analogy? I absolutely loved it. I think that's such a clear picture of where we are all at. Not one of us is able to reach the stars, no matter where we are in life, and not one of us is able to be good enough to earn God's approval. These verses that we read this morning are further saying that if anyone could boast that they could earn God's approval, it would have been Abraham. After all, he was the father of the Jewish nation and had been chosen by God. It says, Abraham was, humanly speaking, the founder of our Jewish nation. What did he discover about being made right with God? If his good deeds had made him acceptable to God, he would have had something to boast about. But that was not God's way. That was not God's way. So how did Abraham make himself right with God? It says, for the scriptures tell us Abraham believed God and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. So even Abraham himself couldn't earn his way into heaven. He had to believe God and put his trust in him, just like you and me. It was his faith and trust in God that made him right. And the reason that Paul chose to use that particular example of Abraham when he was writing to the church of Rome was Abraham was an Old Testament believer who trusted and believed God. And this would have been really relevant. It would have been a really relevant example to the Jews. The Jews thought that Abraham, as pointed out in our reading, was the founder of the Jewish religion. And they thought that he'd pleased God by his obedience to the Old Testament law, the Old Testament Torah. But in fact, that wasn't the case at all. And this letter to the Romans references a bit in Genesis 15, verse 6, which confirms that Abraham believed God. That verse in Genesis says this, and Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous, that means good, because of his faith. But apart from endorsing the message that Heather gave us last week, what else can we learn from the Old Testament believers? We've learned how they made themselves right with God, but what else can we learn? Well, I'd like to focus our thoughts this morning on verses 7 and 8 from our reading. They say this, oh, what joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sins are put out of sight. Yes, what joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of sin. And I want to focus initially on verse 8. What joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of sin. The NIV version of this verse sheds a little bit more light on it, and I think it's good to compare the two and look at them alongside each other. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against him. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against him. This verse, whichever version you're looking at, talks about God no longer keeping a record of our wrongs, not counting them against us. Now, we count a lot of things in life, don't we? Children count the number of days to their birthdays or the number of days to Christmas. Some people count sheep when they cannot get to sleep at night. Some people count calories, hoping to lose weight. Been there, done that. Some people have even tried to count the stars. And who remembers the show Countdown? Now, I'm not sure if it's still going or not. I don't get time to look at it. You know, that sound of that clock, do-do-do, 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 as it counted down to when they had to give their answer. And some of you might be counting the minutes till I stop talking. We're told to count our blessings as well, aren't we? All the good gifts from God and the way that he's been with us. And while we're talking about counting records, in the Bible, according to Mr. Google, there are 783,137 words in the King James Version of the Bible and 727,969 words in the NIV version of the Bible. But in our family recently, we've been counting something else. We've been counting these. Now, you probably can't see here, but that is what I'm holding up. We've been counting frogs. We've been counting frogs. So let me explain. At Christmas, James and I separately found one of these little green frogs in our house. I can't remember where I found mine. I think it was in the plant pot, and I don't know where James found his. But he found one, and we didn't mention it to each other because I think we both thought, oh, grandchildren, they've left some frogs in the house, like you do. Well, we didn't really think anything of it, and we didn't mention it to each other. But one day over Christmas, Sarah came with her children, and we were sitting at the kitchen table, and she just looked down and she went, "Mum, there's a green frog in your plant pot." I went, "I beg your pardon?" She said, "There's a green frog in your plant pot." "Oh, no, it's the frog man." I went, "I beg your pardon?" She said, "We've been finding these frogs all over our house." So we thought, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And a frog hunt then pursued. And these little fellas were found in various daring poses around our house. So you can see there was one by a plant pot, one outside, one on the very top corner over there. They were everywhere. They were absolutely everywhere. And the more you sat down, you thought, well, when you ignored the dust and the cobwebs, there's a frog up there. And we didn't know where they'd come from. And we just hadn't noticed them before. But of course, the kids had great fun trying to find them. And we then put a message in our family WhatsApp group. And then Hannah messaged they'd found some too. So somebody clearly had been hiding frogs in the house. Now, we thought we'd all gone quiet on the frog front until the other morning, when all the family members went out and found that during the previous night, there had been another frog-a-lanch, as demonstrated here. Oh, these are all the frogs that we found in our house, by the way. That's how many we found, and I've just brought a couple, and it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, we went out, and during the night, someone who clearly has too much time on their hands had gone round and put frogs on outside. I think there might be another slide potentially. Yeah, we go. Okay, so somebody, who knows who, had driven to Stanley, Blackhall Mill, Blaydon and Hydefield during the night or evening previously and put frogs everywhere. And the family WhatsApp group was going bonkers. I found another frog, I found another frog. However, nobody would admit to being the frogman, the culprit. Now, we all have our suspicions, and they might just be sitting at the back of the church. Now, he swears blind it isn't him. No, I don't mean Mr. Oliver. I don't think he's got the time to do this. But who knows? He says it isn't him. We all know how good he was at Would I Lie to You at the church weekend away. So as well as counting things, people also keep records of things, don't they? I wonder how many of you have a diary. How many of you have a diary? Oh, quite a few. My nana used to have a 5-year diary, and she religiously wrote in it every night before she went to bed. And when she died, we found a stack of these 5-year diaries. I mean, it must have covered decades. As I say, she used to write in it every night, and she had many diaries. And in the days before Facebook reminded you of what you'd done this time X number of years ago, she was able to look it up and remind herself and us of what she'd done. Some people keep a record of how many miles they've walked and where. Some people keep a record of the holidays they've gone on. Train spotters keep records of which trains they've seen and where. Now, whether we count things or jot down a record of something, we are keeping a permanent reminder of an event, aren't we? We have a permanent reminder with our photographs of all the frogs. But let's go back to our verse 8. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against him. Or, the other version, what joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of sin. God has wiped our record clear. He has wiped our heavenly criminal record clear. He no longer counts the things that we've done wrong. And that record is wiped permanently clean. Permanently clean. Now, I don't know about you, but I would not want everyone here today, you all here this morning, to see every part of my life played out on the screen like EastEnders behind me, so that you could see every single mistake I have ever made, or every thought I had ever made and thought, or everything that I'd ever done wrong. I wouldn't want you to see that. And I'm pretty certain that you guys wouldn't want your life up there for everyone to see too. But God has said that we can have our record wiped clear, wiped completely clean as if it never existed. And do you know what? That knowledge brings great joy. And with that joy, peace, and with that peace, assurance. So what can we learn from the Old Testament believers like Abraham? Well, the first thing was we discovered that they didn't try and earn their way to pleasing God. Just like Abraham, they had faith in God and believed in him and what he said. But what else can they teach us? Well, the New Testament talks a lot about faith and trust of the Old Testament believers. Hebrews 11 tells us about the faith of those in the Old Testament. Now, I was going to talk about them individually to you. But you know what? The Bible puts it so much better than I could. So I think we should just read most of that chapter and you'll see what I mean. I won't read all of chapter 11 in its entirety. I've taken bits from it. But I would encourage you to go home today and read the whole of Hebrews chapter 11. Just if you can. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients, now the ancients means the Old Testament believers, this is what the Old Testament believers were commended for. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city whose foundations, whose architect and builder is God. That means they were looking forward to heaven and to Jesus' coming. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. And by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. I think you will agree that the Bible puts it way better than ever I could, trying to describe these Old Testament believers. These Old Testament believers lived by faith. It kept saying, by faith, by faith, by faith. They were living in the book. They couldn't skip to the end. But what is faith? What is faith? Faith is an act of humble acceptance. Faith makes no demands on the giver, nor is the giver obliged to respond. Faith is an act of humble acceptance. That means accepting a gift, knowing it is not deserved and that it's not earned, but accepting it nonetheless. The giver is not obliged to respond. There is no obligation, but the giver responds anyway. And in our case with God, he responds in love. I think faith can be summed up like this. I think we have a slide here. Forsaking all, I trust him. And that's what the Old Testament believers did. Forsaking, that means giving up, leaving behind all. Everything that I'm relying on that isn't God. Whether that's the fact that our parents had us christened as babies, or we've always come to church, or we always try and do the right thing, or we like supporting charities and we like being nice to people. Forsaking all, everything that isn't God. I trust, I believe in Jesus as God's Son. I trust him. Forsaking all, I trust him. And if we do these things, if we show faith, just like the Old Testament believers did, look what is promised in those verses that we read. Joy. Joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sins are put out of sight. Joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of sin. Joy, that is what is promised. Joy that comes from peace and the assurance that no matter what comes our way, God has our back and that our record has been wiped clean. We can be right with God. That gives joy and a peace and assurance. So what can these Old Testament believers teach us? Even when they were called to act, like Noah building the ark when it had never rained yet, they had faith. Even when they prayed for something and it didn't seem to happen, like Abraham or Hannah wanting children, they had faith. Even when the worst of times was happening, like Job who lost his whole family, they had faith. Even when it meant leaving family and friends like Abraham or Ruth, they had faith. And even when it meant they were persecuted, they were laughed at, they were jeered. Even when they were persecuted like Daniel, they had faith. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. The Old Testament believers didn't see, but they looked forward and trusted. They were living the book. They were living the book. Looking at their faith, can encourage us this morning. Let me ask you, are you struggling because of things that are going on in your life? Are you going through things you don't always understand? Are you praying and it seems like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling and not being heard? Are you struggling to know which path to take? Are you having to walk in faith rather than by sight? Remember faith. Faith is forsaking all, I trust him. So as I ask the band to come back up, I think it would be good for us to just take a moment to pray together. Heavenly Father, help us to remember today that nothing we can do can earn our way into your good books. Help us to remember the example of the Old Testament believers who simply believed and trusted you even when things were difficult. Help us to forsake all and trust in you. Help us to have faith in you. We ask this in your name. Amen.